Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today I'll be telling you the fifth and final part of our journey through the Aeneid by Virgil, written around 19 BC. Aeneas has left the realm of the dead and now knows what he has suffered for all these years. Before him lies the land that was promised to him, but it does not lie empty. In this part, he reaches his goal at last and must fight for it. It is the story of the end of a long journey and of the price it demands. Make yourself comfortable, leave the day behind you, and come along one last time. The ships of the Trojans sailed along the coast until they came to the mouth of a great river that poured sluggish and yellowish into the sea. Over the forests on its banks rose flocks of birds, and the land beyond lay wide and fertile in the morning sun. Aeneas commanded them to enter the river, and so the ships glided between the shady banks until they landed at a suitable spot. The men went ashore, weary from the long voyage and hungry. They spread flat loaves of bread on the grass, laid fruit and fieldfare upon them, and ate. And when the food was consumed, in their hunger, they reached for the flat loaves themselves and ate them too. Then young Ascanius cried jestingly that they were even eating their tables. Aeneas heard these words, and a shudder ran down his back, for he remembered the dark prophecy that had once been given to them, that such a hunger would befall them that they would devour their own tables, and that at this very place their wandering should find its end. What had appeared to them then as a threatened punishment now proved to be the sign of arrival. Aeneas rose, moved, spread out his hands, and greeted the land that was destined for him. Here it was. Here the new home was to stand. He had garlands woven, sacrificed to the gods, and thanked them, and a rejoicing went through the camp of the Trojans, who after so many years were at last at their goal. The land into which they had come was called Latium, and over it ruled an old king named Latinus, a peaceful man who had quietly governed his people for many years. He had no son to succeed him, but only a single daughter, Lavinia, a girl of marriageable age, for whom many men from all over the land were suitors. The stateliest and most powerful among them was Turnus, a young king of a neighboring people, bold, handsome, and of ancient lineage. Queen Amata, the wife of Latinus, wished for this union with all her heart, and pressed for the daughter to be given to Turnus. But the gods had ordained otherwise, and sign upon sign announced it. A swarm of bees settled in a sacred tree, and the seers interpreted that a stranger would come and take over the rule. And when Lavinia stood at the altar, her hair suddenly seemed wreathed in flames without burning, a sign of great glory for herself, but of heavy war for her people. Alarmed, Latinus sought the oracle of his father, and from there came the clear answer. He should give his daughter to no man of his own people. A son-in-law would come from abroad, and from this union would spring a race whose fame would reach to the stars, and whom the whole world would obey. Aeneas sent 100 men as envoys to the city of Latinus, with gifts and a peaceful request. The king received them in his old palace, a venerable building with 100 columns in which stood the images of his ancestors. The Trojans brought forward their request. They came not as enemies, they said, but as homeless men to whom fate had shown this land. They asked for a small piece of earth for their gods and a place on the coast, no more than that. And they presented to the king gifts from ancient Troy, a scepter, a robe, a golden bowl. Latinus listened to them and thought of the oracle. A stranger from a far land, a son-in-law from abroad. This Aeneas must be the one. Kindly, he answered that his land stood open to them, and that he would give Aeneas his daughter to wife if he wished it. He sent the envoys back with horses and gifts, and the Trojans returned to the camp with the best news they could have hoped for. Peace seemed made, the goal reached, and all the suffering of the years seemed to pass over into fulfillment. But high above all, Juno, the old enemy of the Trojans, saw how her work threatened to fail. Her anger broke forth anew. "Stop it," she admitted to herself. She could no longer stop fate. But she could delay it and make it dearly paid for. If the powers of heaven would not stand by her, then she would call up the powers of the underworld. She summoned one of the Furies, a dark shape that carries discord and madness among men, and sent her down to Latium. The Fury first entered Queen Amata. She crept up to her and threw one of her serpents into her breast, and the poison crept into the queen's heart. At first, Amata still tried with words and tears to change her husband's mind and to keep Lavinia for Turnus. When that did not help, madness seized her. She raged through the city, carried her daughter off into the woods, and called on the other women to do the same, and soon they swarmed in wild excitement through the mountains. Then the Fury sought out Turnus. She appeared to him in sleep, first in the shape of an old priestess, and mocked him. He let a stranger take his bride and his honor, and slept on peacefully. Turnus laughed at her, even in the dream. Then the Fury threw off her disguise and stood before him in her true shape, with torches and darting serpents. A terror ran through him, cold sweat broke out on him, and when he awoke, he was another man. Wrath had seized him, the love of arms and the fury over the wrong he had suffered. He called his men together and had them arm for war against the Trojans. But still the spark was lacking that would kindle the dry wood, and for that too the Fury saw to it. Young Ascanius had gone hunting with his dogs, and in the woods the Fury drove a splendid stag before his eyes. What Ascanius did not know, the animal was tame and belonged to the children of a man who tended the royal herds. They had raised it, adorned it with flowers, and cared for it, and it returned home of itself every evening. Ascanius, driven by the eagerness of the hunt and the wish for glory, drew his bow and hit it. Badly wounded, the stag dragged itself home and died there amid laments. Then the girl who had raised it ran into the fields and called the peasants together, and the Fury stoked the excitement. With cudgels, charred stakes, and whatever came to hand, the herdsmen streamed up, and the Trojans hurried to help their own people. Out of the quarrel came a battle, and in this first skirmish the first dead fell on both sides, among them the eldest son of that herdsman, who had thrown himself between the fighters to make peace. Now the blood had flowed, and there was no going back. The herdsmen carried their dead into the city and demanded revenge. Turnus and the queen strengthened the uproar. The people pressed the king to declare war. Latinus resisted as long as he could. He implored them to consider the oracle and to keep the peace, but no one listened to him. When he saw that he stood alone and could accomplish nothing more, he withdrew into his palace and gave up the rule. It was the custom in that land that at the beginning of a war the king himself should open the gates of a sacred temple, but Latinus refused. Then Juno herself descended and thrust the gate wings open. And now all Latium armed. From everywhere the peoples came together. Peasants left their fields, smiths sharpened the old weapons, and the leaders gathered their bands. Turnus stood at their head, tall and with a helmet crowned by a fire-breathing monster. Beside him rode many other princes with their men, and among them was also Camilla, a young warrior who commanded a people of riders. She had grown up from childhood in the woods, devoted to the hunt and to arms, and her swiftness was so great that it was said she could run over a field of grain without bending the ears. So a mighty army grew and marched against the small band of Trojans who had only just begun to fortify their camp at the river mouth. That night, Aeneas lay on the bank and found no rest, for the worry about the coming war weighed heavily on him. Then there appeared to him in a dream the god of the river beside which his camp stood, an old man with a head wreathed in reeds. He spoke courage to him and advised him to sail upstream. There, at the 7 hills, lived a king named Euander, who came from Greece and was at enmity with the Latins. With him he would find help. In the morning, Aeneas set out with 2 ships, and the stream bore him gently upstream. He came to a modest settlement where cattle grazed on the hills and the people lived simply, at that very place where one day a great city would stand. King Euander received him kindly, recognized in him a distant kinsman, and promised him his help. He himself was too old for war, he said, but he would give him his only son, young Pallas, and with him 400 horsemen. And he advised him to make an alliance with the Etruscans, a mighty people in the neighborhood who had risen against their own cruel ruler and were seeking a leader from abroad. When Euander let his son go, he embraced him long and begged the gods to let him return unharmed. He would rather die than hear the news of the boy's death. Pallas rode away at Aeneas's side, happy and full of eagerness for deeds, and Aeneas took him up like a son of his own. Meanwhile, Venus sent her son a gift. She asked her husband, the god of the forge, to make weapons for Aeneas, and in the depths of a mountain of fire, his helpers forged armor, helmet, and sword. Above all, though, they made a mighty shield, into whose metal images were worked, images of deeds that were to happen only in the distant future, of battles and victories of that people that would spring from Aeneas. Venus brought him the weapons in a quiet valley, and Aeneas marveled at the shield without understanding the images. He knew only that he bore the future of his line on his shoulder. While he was still away, there happened in the camp of the Trojans what Turnus had hoped for. Scarcely was the leader out of sight when he attacked with his army. The Trojans held to the order Aeneas had left them and stayed behind their ramparts instead of meeting him in open field battle. Turnus surrounded the camp, tried to set fire to the ships, and mocked the besieged. And that night, 2 young Trojans formed a bold resolve. Nisus and Euryalus, 2 friends who were devoted to each other, wished to steal through the enemy lines to bring word to Aeneas and call him back. The 2 friends laid their plan before the leaders, and these let them go, with tears and rich promises. Young Euryalus asked only one thing. Should he not return, they should stand by his mother, who, as the only woman, had followed him into the uncertain. In the darkness, the 2 crept through the enemy camp, where the men lay sleeping in the grass after their carousing. They came through unhindered, but success made them careless, and Euryalus took a splendid helmet from a slain man and put it on. When the 2 had almost reached the sheltering thicket, an enemy troop of horsemen came along the way, and the moonlight broke in the stolen helmet and betrayed him. The horsemen attacked. In the dense woods, the friends lost each other, and when Nisus noticed that Euryalus had fallen behind, he turned back and found him surrounded by enemies. He tried to save him, and when he saw that it was too late, he threw himself into the midst of the foe to fall at his side. So both died, and in the morning the enemy carried their heads on spears before the camp. When the mother of Euryalus learned of it, she raised a lament that went through the whole camp and made the men's hearts heavy, until they gently led her back into her tent. Then the battle for the ramparts broke loose with full force. Turnus pressed forward, and once he even succeeded in breaking through an opened gate into the interior of the camp. There he wrought a terrible slaughter, and had he in that moment thought to open the gate for his men, the war would have been decided that day. But the fury of battle did not let him seize the thought, and when the Trojans gathered and pressed him from all sides, only flight remained to him. He leaped in full armor from the wall into the river, and the waves carried him back to his own. At the same time, Aeneas returned with the ships of the Etruscans and with Pallas at his side. When the besieged caught sight of the sails on the horizon, a rejoicing rose up on the ramparts. Aeneas stood at the stern of his ship, the shining shield raised, and the enemy recognized with terror that the leader of the Trojans was back. A hard battle began on the shore, in which those landing had to fight for every foot, and in the midst of this tumult, young Pallas fought for the first time in his life, spurred on his men, and distinguished himself until Turnus grew aware of him. Turnus made his men draw back and met young Pallas alone. He was far superior to him in strength and experience, yet Pallas did not give way. He hurled his spear and struck, and the weapon grazed the shoulder of his opponent. Then Turnus threw. His spear pierced the shield and the armor and drove deep into the breast of the youth. Pallas sank to the ground and died. Turnus set his foot on the corpse, took from him the precious sword belt, a broad girdle studded with gold, and put it on himself. In that moment, he did not suspect that with it he was pronouncing his own sentence. He left the dead man to his people so that they could bring him to his father. When the news reached Aeneas, his grief turned into a wrath such as he had never felt. He had promised old Euander to watch over the boy, and this promise was broken. He sought Turnus across the whole battlefield, but Juno withdrew the opponent from him by a phantom and saved his life one last time. After the battle, a truce was concluded so that both sides could bury their dead. Aeneas had the body of Pallas brought to his father with all honors, and over the settlement at the 7 Hills rose the lament of the old king who received his only son. He did not accuse Aeneas, but he spoke out what remained to him, that he now waited only for the news that Turnus had atoned. In the city of Latinus, too, the people mourned, and many asked themselves why a single man should be allowed to buy his bride with the blood of a whole people. Latinus proposed to cede land to the Trojans and to make peace, but Turnus refused and offered to decide the quarrel in single combat with Aeneas. Before it came to that, the battle broke out anew, and in it fell Camilla too, the young warrior. She had long dominated the cavalry fight until a spear struck her from the side while her gaze hung on a gleaming suit of armor. Dying, she sent a message to Turnus. He should come and save the city. Her death shook the Latins, and the ranks wavered. So it came about that both sides were weary of the war and pressed to have the whole matter settled between the two men whose cause it was. The next morning, everything was made ready for the single combat. The armies took their places on both sides of the field and laid down their weapons. Altars were raised, and Latinus and Aeneas swore a solemn treaty. If Aeneas fell, the Trojans would leave the land. If he won, he demanded no rule over the Latins. Both peoples should live together under equal law, and the old city should keep its name. Turnus stepped forward, pale and silent, and the Latins looked at him and suddenly found him too weak for this opponent. A murmur went through the ranks. Juno used this one last time. She sent the sister of Turnus, a nymph of the water among the Latins, and she took the shape of a respected warrior and urged the men not to sacrifice their brave leader to a single combat. A sign in the sky did the rest. An eagle swooped down on a swan, but was beset by a swarm of other birds and let the prey fall. A seer interpreted it as an omen of victory, and in the next moment a spear flew over from the ranks of the Latins and killed a man. The treaty was broken, and the battle flared up again. Aeneas hurried unarmed between the fighters with raised hands and cried that they should hold. The treaty stood. He alone had the right to fight. While he was still calling, an arrow from the crowd struck him, and he had to withdraw. Turnus took new courage and raged over the field. In the camp, an old physician tried in vain to draw the missile from the wound. Then Venus stepped up unrecognized and mixed a healing juice into the water, and the arrowhead loosened of itself, and the wound closed. Aeneas put on his weapons again, embraced his son Ascanius, and spoke to him the words that he should learn courage from him and good fortune from others. Then he returned to the field. He sought only Turnus, but his sister steered her brother's chariot again and again out of his reach. Then Aeneas formed a resolve. Instead of searching further, he turned against the city itself, which lay unguarded, and had them make ready for the assault. When in the city the din broke out and smoke rose, Queen Amata believed that Turnus had fallen and that everything was her fault. In her despair, she took her own life. Turnus, out on the field, heard the lament come across from the city and understood what was happening. He bade his sister be silent and faced what was destined for him. He left the chariot and went on foot through the ranks toward the walls and cried that they should cease the fight. He alone would now atone what was to be atoned. The armies drew back and formed a wide circle, and in its midst the two men stood facing each other. They hurled their spears and then went at each other with their swords, and the blades struck upon each other so that it echoed far over the field. But Turnus, in his haste, had seized the wrong sword, that of a charioteer, and when he led the full blow, the blade broke on the divine armor of Aeneas. Weaponless, he fled around in a circle, and Aeneas followed him, although the arrow shot still hindered him. 5 times they circled the field thus before the eyes of the silent armies. High above them, Jupiter turned to Juno and asked her how long she still wished to delay the fight. Fate stood firm, and she knew it. Then Juno gave in at last. She let go of her rancor, but she asked one thing. If peace must come, then the people of the Latins should not be absorbed into that of the strangers. They should keep their name, their language, their dress, and Troy should not rise again in them. Jupiter granted it to her with a smile. Both peoples should merge into one under the name and the language of the Latins, and from this mixture would spring a race that would surpass all in piety. So ended the anger of the goddess who had pursued the Trojans all their lives long. But on the field, the fight neared its end. Aeneas threw his spear, and it pierced the thigh of Turnus, so that the great man broke to his knees. A groan went through the ranks of the Latins. Turnus raised his hand and spoke calmly to the victor. He had deserved it, he said, and did not beg for mercy for himself. Aeneas should think of his own father, and at least give the body back to his people. Lavinia was his, the quarrel decided. Aeneas paused. The words struck him, and already he began to waver and to let his arms sink. But then his gaze fell on the shoulder of the vanquished, and there gleamed in the light the broad, gold-studded girdle that Turnus had taken from young Pallas. The sight tore the wound open again. Aeneas saw before him the boy whom he had promised to the old father, and wrath overcame him. "It was not he," he cried, "who imposed the punishment here, but Pallas demanded his right." And with this word he thrust home, and the life of Turnus escaped into the shadows. So ended the war for Latium, and with it the long wandering that had begun years ago in a burning city. Aeneas married Lavinia and founded the city that was destined for him, and both peoples grew together as the gods had decreed. He himself was to enjoy this new home for only a few years, but his son and his descendants carried on what he had begun. And centuries later, at those 7 hills by the river where once old Euander had let his cattle graze, there rose the city whose name was to move the world. What old Anchises had shown his son in the realm of the dead came to fulfillment long after Aeneas himself had gone to his rest. That was our short retelling of the 5th and final part of the Aeneid by Virgil. We have accompanied Aeneas to his goal and seen what the last step cost him. Out of the man who once fled from burning Troy with his father on his shoulders came the founder of a new people, and all that he lost on this long journey was the price for something that he himself would never see completed. With that, our journey through the Aeneid comes to a close. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow at Sleepy Classic Tales.